So far, we have learned two bonding models, Lewis structures and Vesper theory, both of which are stepping stones to more advanced topics like valence bond theory, which we'll be introducing in this lecture. Valence bond theory is a bonding model that takes a more physical approach to bonding by first considering the stabilization of the potential energy of atoms when forming a covalent bond. The diagram on the right, which we have seen previously, is referred to as a Leonard-Jones potential graph. Previously, we discussed how two atoms interact when they are brought close together. The energy of the individual atoms starts high and then decreases due to the stabilizing attraction that forms between the negatively charged electrons in one atom and the positively charged protons in the other atom. We now want to think about this interaction as an overlap between electron orbitals, and in the case of the two hydrogen atoms in this diagram, it would be the overlap between their half-filled 1s orbitals. Increasing overlap between these two orbitals leads to a lower energy for the molecule and therefore a more stable bond. However, we must also remember that if the nuclei in the atoms get too close together, the protons in each nucleus will repel each other, leading to a destabilization in energy, which is why the energy in this diagram reaches a minimum and then spikes as the distance between the atoms continues to decrease. The energy minimum represents the distance between the hydrogen nuclei where the 1s orbitals have significant overlap and there is still minimal repulsion between the two nuclei. And the diagram tells us the bond length at this minimum as well as the bond energy at this minimum. In the previous example of a hydrogen-hydrogen bond being formed, the overlapping orbitals were 1s orbitals, which are perfectly symmetric. This means that the overlap between the orbitals does not depend on the orientation of the orbitals to each other. However, with all other types of electron orbitals, the orientation is very important as it will affect the amount of overlap between the orbitals and therefore the strength of the bond or interaction between the atoms. Greater overlap occurs when orbitals are oriented towards each other along a straight line and leads to more stabilization and stronger bonds. Orbitals that are oriented at an angle will not have very efficient overlap, leading to less stabilization and weaker bonds. There are two types of classifications for the way that orbitals can overlap. A sigma bond is formed when only one phase of an orbital overlaps with one phase on another orbital. This also happens to be the case when the overlap occurs along a straight line that passes through both nuclei and through the center of the overlap region of the two orbitals. Note that sigma bonds will always occur with the overlap of two s orbitals, and that p orbitals can also generate sigma bonds either by overlap with an s orbital or with another p orbital in what we call an end-to-end or head-on fashion. A pi bond is formed when both phases of an orbital overlap with both phases of another orbital. This type of overlap is often referred to as side-by-side or side-on. And a line drawn between the nuclei will now pass through a node on both orbitals. Remember, a node is a plane with zero probability of finding an electron. Note that s orbitals cannot form pi bonds as only one phase exists at a time for an s orbital, whereas p, d, and f orbitals always have both a positive and negative phase present and therefore can exhibit pi bonding. Here are some examples of multiple bonds that are comprised of both sigma and pi orbital overlap. For an oxygen molecule, the pink p orbitals that are oriented towards each other in a head-on fashion will form a sigma bond, whereas the green p orbitals that are oriented in a side-on fashion will form a pi bond. Therefore, the double bond in oxygen is comprised of a pp sigma bond and a pp pi bond. The orbital overlap for pi bonds is generally weaker than for sigma bonds, so the strength of a double bond will typically have a higher contribution from the sigma bond than from the pi bond. In the case of the nitrogen molecule, here we see the same head-on overlap of one set of p orbitals to form the sigma bond, but now there are two sets of p orbitals with side-on overlap forming pi bonds in both the vertical and the horizontal direction. Therefore, the triple bond in nitrogen is comprised of a pp sigma bond and two pp pi bonds. Notice how the pi bonds in this figure are smeared out to show the resulting region of electron density spread across the internuclear distance, unlike the first figure for oxygen, where this was represented simply with a green line connecting the two orbitals. Comparing a single bond between two atoms to a double bond between the same two atoms, note that the energy of the double bond is not double the energy of the sigma bond. As previously mentioned, a sigma bond has better orbital overlap than a pi bond, and therefore has more energy than a pi bond. The single bond contains that stronger sigma bond, whereas the double bond contains the same stronger sigma bond, but then adds a weaker pi bond. So we don't expect the energy to double because a double bond is not composed of two strong sigma bonds. Similarly, going from a single bond to a triple bond, we don't see the energy triple because a triple bond adds two of the weaker pi bonds to a sigma bond. Again, a triple bond is not the same as three sigma bonds. Finally, note that the bond lengths correlate with overall bond strength, with stronger triple bonds giving the shortest bond lengths. So bond strengths will depend on the number of bonds that form between the atoms, as well as the types of atoms that are involved in bonding, as we see with these nitrogen-halogen single bonds shown below that have different lengths and different strengths. So how do we predict which orbitals will overlap to form bonds? Valence bond theory assumes that the best overlap will result when two half-filled orbitals, each containing about one electron, overlap in order to share their electrons equally and pair the spins of the electrons. However, it is also possible for overlap to occur between a filled orbital with two electrons and an empty orbital with 0 electrons, although this is less common but can result when there is a large electronegativity difference between the two atoms. Let's look at the case of hydrosulfuric acid, or H2S. We can draw an orbital diagram for each of the atoms in H2S by considering their valence electrons. Each hydrogen has one electron in a 1s orbital, as shown here, and the sulfur has 2 valence electrons in the 3s orbital and 4 valence electrons in the 3p orbitals. Hund's rule dictates that one electron goes into each orbital in a subshell first before beginning to pair. So we can see that sulfur's 3p orbitals have 3 electrons spread over all of 3 of the orbitals, with the 4th electron going into the first p orbital to form a pair. This leaves 2 p orbitals on sulfur that are half-filled, which can overlap with the 2 half-filled hydrogen 1s orbitals. Now, if we look at the spatial arrangement of these orbitals, we can see that no matter which p orbital the hydrogens choose to overlap with, the resulting sigma bond will always form a 90-degree angle with each other. Note that the hydrogen orbitals cannot overlap with opposite lobes of the same p orbital, which is why they can't be 180 degrees apart or opposite each other. So, valence bond theory predicts that H2S has a bent structure with a bond angle of about 90 degrees, which is very close to the actual bond angle in H2S of 92 degrees. However, if we look at the Lewis structure for H2S shown above and apply Vesper theory, we will predict a tetrahedral molecular geometry for the structure, which gives a bond angle that is closer to 109.5 degrees. So valence bond theory appears to do a better job at predicting the actual bond angle for H2S, whereas the Lewis structure approach does accurately predict that the structure should be bent, but doesn't give the correct bond angle. Now, let's look at the case of carbon, which has 2 valence electrons in the 2s orbital and 2 valence electrons in the 2p orbitals, giving 2 half-filled p orbitals with 1 empty p orbital. Based on valence bond theory, carbon's electron configuration would only allow for 2 hydrogen atoms to form bonds, because there are only 2 half-filled p orbitals on carbon that the half-filled hydrogen s orbitals can overlap with. Another half-filled hydrogen s orbital will not overlap with the empty carbon p orbital because 2 electrons are needed to stabilize the overlap. And even if a third hydrogen were to overlap with that empty p orbital, this would still only allow for 3 hydrogen atoms to bond to carbon, as there aren't any more p orbitals on carbon. But we know that carbon can bond to 4 hydrogen atoms because the molecule methane, or CH4, exists. Additionally, let's say carbon does form 2 bonds with hydrogen as shown in the orbital diagram on the right. If we consider the geometry of this overlap, we would again see a 90-degree angle between the two resulting sigma bonds. But we know that CH4 has a tetrahedral geometry and should therefore have bond angles of 109.5 degrees, which is a lot larger than 90 degrees. So what is going on here? Well, it turns out that valence bond theory on its own is not enough to explain bonding in all molecules, so our approach needs to be modified a bit to allow for more flexibility, which brings us to hybridization. Hybridization is this approach in valence bond theory of combining atomic orbitals on individual atoms to form hybrid orbitals. For methane, CH4, and all other tetrahedral carbons, the atomic orbitals on carbon undergo sp3 hybridization, where the 2s orbital and the 3 2p orbitals combine together to yield 4 sp3 hybrid orbitals. Note that 4 atomic orbitals are combined, therefore 4 hybrid orbitals are formed. The sp3 label is meant to indicate the atomic orbitals that are being combined, 1 s orbital and 3 p orbitals. Notice that that 3 does not refer to electrons this time, but actually the number of orbitals. Also notice that the sp3 orbitals are at an energy between the original atomic orbitals and that they are degenerate, which means they are all the same energy. So when we redistribute the 4 valence electrons into the hybrid orbitals, Hund's rule again dictates that 1 electron needs to go into each orbital of the same energy before they begin to pair. So we now have 4 orbitals that are half filled, and therefore 4 hydrogen s orbitals should be able to overlap with each of these 4 half-filled orbitals on carbon to give methane. But will the hybrid orbitals also give the correct bond angle for methane, the 109.5 degrees? Well, if we look at this pictorially, here we see 4 orbital shapes that are being combined. The new hybrid orbitals look a bit like p orbitals, but with one lobe that is bigger than the other. Mathematically, the new orbitals will orient themselves in such a way as to minimize repulsions and overlap between the hybrid orbitals themselves. This is very similar to Vesper theory, where the electron groups around the central atom spread themselves out in such a way as to minimize repulsions and therefore be as far away from each other as possible. If you remember, 4 electron groups in Vesper theory would spread out to form a tetrahedral arrangement. Therefore, the 4 hybrid orbitals formed from sp3 hybridization will do the same thing, taking on a tetrahedral arrangement where the angle between each orbital is 109.5 degrees, and therefore any bonds formed with these orbitals would also be 109.5 degrees. So, if we go back to the case of methane, we can now see that not only does hybridization allow for valence bond theory to explain how 4 hydrogens can bond to carbon, but it also accurately predicts the bond angle of methane. Another similar case is ammonia, or NH3. Nitrogen has 1 additional valence electron compared to carbon, so it also undergoes sp3 hybridization, but it will have 5 electrons spread out across its 4 hybrid orbitals. This leads to 3 partially filled hybrid orbitals and 1 full hybrid orbital. Note that this accurately predicts that nitrogen should be able to bond to 3 hydrogen atoms and that the lone pair on ammonia is essentially represented by the full hybrid orbital. However, the bond angle in ammonia is slightly less at 107 degrees instead of 109.5 degrees. And this can be explained by considering that having 1 hybrid orbital behave as a lone pair lowers the tendency for hybridization, as there are only 3 bonds being formed that help stabilize the molecule instead of the 4 bonds that could have been possible as in the case of methane. Therefore, hybridization is not as favorable for ammonia as it is for methane. In summary, if a Lewis structure predicts 4 electron groups around a central atom, then we expect tetrahedral geometry and bond angles close to 109.5 degrees. Hybridization and valence bond theory show us that these conditions can be achieved if the atom uses sp3 hybrid orbitals for all bonds and lone pairs, and that the overlap between the hybrid orbitals on the central atom and the atomic orbitals on other atoms will create sigma bonds. There are many other types of hybridization, which will be the focus of the next mini-lecture. This concludes the 3rd mini-lecture for Chapter 7, and it's the first of the material that will be covered on midterm number 3. Please note any questions you may have about this material and how it is utilized to solve problems in the sapling homework or end of chapter exercises for this chapter. Please post any urgent questions on Piazza. I will also take questions on this material during one of our virtual class meetings, and during that time we will focus more on problem solving for concepts in this chapter.